You're here to find out what is a secondary dominant chord, so let's talk about it. So a secondary dominant chord is an altered chord having a dominant or leading tone relationship to a chord in the key other than the tonic. There's a lot here, so let's dissect it one piece at a time. The first piece of information we have is that it is an altered chord. So what is an altered chord? An altered chord is any chord containing at least one note that is foreign to the key. So as an example, in C major, there are no sharps or flats. C major is just C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. But a D major chord has an F sharp. A D major chord is D, F sharp, and A. So a D major chord would be an altered chord in the context of C major, because C major doesn't have an F sharp. But a D major chord does have an F sharp, so it's an altered chord in the context of C major. The next part is a dominant or leading tone relationship. So let's break down what a dominant chord is. A dominant chord is by definition two things. One, it is a major chord, and two, it is built off of the fifth scale degree in any key. So in C major, G major would be the dominant chord. In G major, D major would be the dominant chord. In A major, E major would be the dominant chord. Now, if you understand what a dominant is, you don't really need to understand what a leading tone is, but since it's part of the definition, a leading tone in this context is usually referring to the seventh scale degree that is just a half step below the tonic. For example, in C major, B would be the leading tone because B is, first of all, the seventh scale degree, and second of all, it is simply one semitone below C. So we've broken down that a secondary dominant must first be an altered chord and second function as a dominant chord to another chord that is naturally occurring in our key. So a naturally occurring or diatonic chord within a key is simply a chord that happens in that key naturally, doesn't contain any notes that aren't in the key. So in C major, our diatonic triads are going to be C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished. So putting all together, we know that our secondary dominant chord is going to be an altered chord. It's going to be a chord that contains at least one note that isn't naturally occurring in our key, and it also is going to be a major chord specifically. We also know that it's going to be a major 5 chord specifically to a chord that is diatonic or is naturally occurring in our current key. So if we have a song in C major that then has a D major chord rather than the naturally occurring D minor chord, and then that D major chord resolves to a G major chord, that D major would be a secondary dominant. A part of the reason it's a secondary dominant is because a D major chord, which includes an F sharp, doesn't naturally occur in C major, so it is an altered chord. It also is a major chord, but the other side to the dominant equation is it also has to be operating as a 5 chord, and D major is a 5 chord to G major. So we just basically pretend if G major was the key, then what would the dominant chord be? A dominant chord in the context of G major is D major because D is the 5 chord in G. For some other examples of secondary dominance that could be in C major, we have an A major to D minor because D minor is naturally occurring in C major, and then an A major is an altered chord because it has a C sharp, which is not contained in C major. C major has a C natural, and also it is operating as a 5 chord or a dominant chord to our D minor, because if we count up from D, D, E, F, G, A, it's the 5 chord, and also it's a major 5 chord, which makes it, by definition, a dominant chord. Another example would be B major to E minor for the same reason. E minor is naturally occurring in C major. B major would be a dominant chord to an E minor, because in E minor, it would be built off of the 5th scale degree. Counting up from E, we have E, F, G, A, B. That's 5. And also it's a major chord, so it is by definition a dominant. And because a B major chord has both a D sharp and an F sharp, it certainly is not naturally occurring in C major, so it is an altered chord. So what are secondary dominants for? Basically, they are to tonicize chords other than the actual tonic chord. What does that mean? Well, Let's take C major again. In C major, our tonic chord is going to be C major. That's our 1 chord. So C major effectively works as the center of gravity for our song. And in C major, our minor 2 chord is going to be a D minor chord. So let's say we want to have a super powerful transition to the D minor chord, where the transition really makes it sound like the song is sort of in D minor just for a brief moment. The way to do that, the way to have a really powerful transition to that D minor chord, even though it's just the 2 chord, minor 2 chords really don't sound resolved in the context of any key. The way to do that is to just have a secondary dominant, which in this context would be an A major chord. So if you want to have an extra powerful transition to one of the chords in your key that isn't your tonic, that isn't your 1 chord, a great way to do that is to have a secondary dominant. Hopefully this is helpful to you. If it was, or if you found some of it really confusing when I said 1 chord and 5 chord and 2 chord and you're like, what on earth is that? A great guide for you is my 4 pillars of music theory that every songwriter needs to know. It breaks down intervals, which is really foundational to everything important in music theory, in my opinion, or pretty much everything important in music theory. Keys, which is super important. Chords in context of keys, which is the most important way to understand chords when you're a songwriter. And then chord progressions in context of keys. Everything is really important to understand in the context of a key, because when it comes to songwriting, almost everything is based on context, and specifically context of keys. So be sure to check that out. That breaks down really what I think are the most foundational, most important, biggest return on your investment things to learn about music theory. And it's totally free, so even better on your investment, because your investment is $0. So be sure to check that out. Songwritertheory.com/music theory guide. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.